There was a lady who died, and she found herself standing in front of heaven gate. St. Peter said, "You cannot come in unless you correctly spell a word." She said, "What word?" He said, "Any word." So she spelled the word Love. St. Peter said, "Welcome to heaven." Then Peter asked her if she would like to take his place. He instructed her, if anybody comes, just to follow the same procedure. Well, in a few minutes, the lady sees her ex-husband coming up. She said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "I just had a heart attack. Did I really make it to heaven?" She said, "No yet. You have to correctly spell a word." He said, "What word?" After a long pause, she said, "Czechoslovakia." Dear friends in Jesus Christ, there is an emphasis on the reality of sin in the readings for the first Sunday of Lent. That emphasis is certainly there in the first reading and to some extent in the second reading as well. Yet, in this morning gospel, there is no trace of sin. That, of course, is because the gospel is not really about us. It is not about everyone. It is a story about one man who was unique, at least in one respect. The letter to the Hebrews speaks of Jesus as the one who, in every respect, has been tested as we are, yet without sin. Like Adam and Eve, he heard God's word. Like them, his fidelity to God's word was put to the test. Unlike them, he passed the test. He remained true to his identity as the faithful Son of God. The gospel this morning then tells us a very different story to the story told by the first reading. Those two readings are at opposite ends at the spectrum. Then we have the second reading, which comes between those two opposites. Paul in that reading is aware of both of those stories, the story of sin and the story of grace, the story of Adam and the story of Christ. Paul contrasts what he calls one man's fall and the good act of one man. Both of those acts, Paul says, have consequence for all of us. Both the story of sin and the story of grace have left their mark on us. Yet, Paul is convinced that the story of grace, the story of Jesus, has left much more significant mark on us than the story of sin, the story of Adam. That is why he says in the reading, the results of the gifts outweighs the results of one's man. A few verses just beyond where our second reading ends, Paul puts that where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. As we begin the Lent, the reading reminds us of the reality of sin and temptation and of our proneness to yield to temptation. They remind us that the story of Adam and Eve can easily become our story. More importantly, however, the reading also reminds us that Jesus' victory over sin is also our story, and that his story can be also our story. We have been baptized into Christ. His Spirit has been poured out into our lives. He lives among us and within each one of us. He is all the time working to live out his own life of faithfulness to God in us and among us. There is a power within us and among us greater than the power of sin, and that is the power of the risen Lord. In one of his letters, Paul says, "It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me." That is something we can all say to some extent. The realization that Christ lives in us, that his power is at work within and among us, and that this power is greater than the power of sin, gives us hope, make us confident as we try to keep on taking the path the Lord is calling us to take. We may fall down, but the Lord is there to lift us to our feet again. We may struggle with some weakness or other, but it is never a doomed struggle because Paul says his power at work within us can do immeasurably more than we can ask or imagine. When we struggle, he struggles with us. Lent is a time to allow the risen Lord to live out his victory over our sin in our lives more fully, so that when Easter comes, we can renew our baptism promises with conviction.